Norway holds the largest pile of money any country has ever owned collectively. As of early 2026, the Norwegian government pension fund Global is worth more than $2 trillion. It owns stakes in over 7,000 companies across 60 countries. It holds roughly 1.5% of every publicly traded stock on Earth. Divided among its citizens, the fund comes to about $390,000 per Norwegian, every man, woman, and child. And yet, the country that owns it has a cultural code written into a 1933 novel by a Danish-Norwegian author, quietly absorbed by the entire society, that says, "You are not to think you are anything special. You are not to think you are better than us. You are not to think you know more than we do. You are not to imagine yourself above us in any way." The richest small nation in the modern world, and the cultural code is not a slogan or a marketing line. It is enforced. The Norwegian king has been photographed riding the Oslo subway. The country's tax records, every citizen's income, every citizen's wealth, are published online for anyone to look at. The Prime Minister, until recently, bicycled to work. The man who runs the fund itself, the largest sovereign wealth fund on Earth, gave away most of his personal fortune to take the job because Norwegians felt he was too visibly rich to be trusted with the public's money. Both things are true at the same time. Norway is, by almost any measurement, one of the wealthiest countries that has ever existed. Norway is also, by self-imposed cultural agreement, not allowed to act like it. What does a country look like when it has the means to dominate and refuses to? This is Norway, a country shaped like a long, narrow ribbon along the western edge of Scandinavia. A coastline that, if you measure all of its fjords and inlets and islands, runs over 29,000 kilometers, almost 3/4 the way around the planet. A population of just 5.5 million people, smaller than the city of Singapore, smaller than the metropolitan area of Atlanta, smaller than the population of Norway's own ancient enemy, England, has been since the year 1100. And inside this ribbon, more than 1,000 fjords carved by 40 separate ice ages. Mountains that were once the size of the Himalayas, slowly worn down over 400 million years. Glaciers that still cover 3% of the mainland. A coast that the Gulf Stream keeps ice-free, even as the Arctic Circle cuts straight across it. For most of recorded history, Norway was poor, a hard country with hard winters, a place where, until oil was found in 1969, the main exports were cod and timber and people. Norway sent more immigrants per capita to the United States in the late 19th century than almost any other nation in Europe, 800,000 of them, out of a population that, at the time, was barely 2 million. Then, 3 days before Christmas, 1969, a phone call came in to the Norwegian Ministry of Industry from an oil company in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. The call was about a well in the North Sea that should have been the company's last attempt before giving up entirely. It was not. What that single phone call set in motion would, within 50 years, make Norway one of the richest places on Earth. And what Norway did with the money that followed, the choices it made, the choices it refused to make, the cultural code it never abandoned, would set Norway apart from almost every other nation that has ever struck it lucky. Before the oil, there was Bergen. On the southwestern coast, sheltered by 7 mountains and 7 islands, sits a city that for 400 years was one of the most important ports in northern Europe. The Hanseatic merchants from Lubeck arrived in the 14th century. They built warehouses out of wood, painted them in deep ochres and reds and yellows, and stocked them with stockfish, cod from the Lofoten Islands, hung in the cold winter wind for 3 months until the flesh was rendered down to a substance harder than wood. Stockfish has no expiration date. A piece of properly dried cod could be stored for a decade and rehydrated into a meal. In a Europe with no refrigeration and no preservation, this was wealth in solid form. Bergen shipped tons of it south every year, to Germany, to England, to the Mediterranean, where Catholic countries needed protein for the long fasting weeks before Easter. The Hanseatic warehouses still stand, slumped sideways from centuries of settling on wet ground. The neighborhood is called Bergen, the wharf, and it is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The smell of dried fish has gone. The wood remains. What Bergen tells you, before you understand anything else about Norway,
is that the country
has known prosperity before. Quiet, durable, sea-based prosperity. The Hanseatic centuries built schools and churches and a merchant class. They did not build palaces. The richest Norwegian in Bergen, in the year 1500, lived in a wooden house slightly larger than his neighbors. This was not Janteloven yet. The word would not be coined for another 400 years. But the pattern was already in place. Inland from Bergen, the land begins to rise, and then it splits open. Sognefjord is the longest fjord in Norway and the deepest in the world. 205 kilometers from the open sea to its innermost arm at the village of Skjolden, and 1,308 meters deep at its lowest point. If you laid the Empire State Building on its side at the bottom of Sognefjord, the top would still be 300 meters underwater. The fjord was carved by ice, 40 separate ice ages, each lasting tens of thousands of years, ground glaciers up to 3 kilometers thick down the same valley over and over. Each glaciation deepened the cut. The bedrock the ice carved through is 2 billion years old, older than the oxygen in the atmosphere, and it took the entirety of that time to produce a landscape that today supports a few hundred farms perched at impossible angles along its walls. Some of those farms are accessible only by boat. Some of them are reachable only by ladders that hang down from above. There used to be a tradition, in the most remote farms, of tying small children to ropes during the day so they would not fall into the fjord while their parents worked the slope.
The people who lived this way
Did not consider themselves brave. They considered themselves Norwegian. The fjord was the country, and the country expected something of them. Above the fjord, in slow circles, hangs the largest bird of prey in Europe. The white-tailed sea eagle has a wingspan of up to 2.5 meters, wider than a man is tall. They mate for life, build their nests on cliff edges along the coast, and will return to the same nesting site for 50 years if undisturbed. A pair of them, working together, can lift a fish weighing 1/3 of their own body mass. By the late 1960s, they were nearly extinct in Norway. Pesticide poisoning from agricultural runoff thinned their eggshells. Hunters shot them on sight.
The population on the entire mainland
Had dropped to fewer than 200 breeding pairs. In 1968, Norway made killing one a crime, punishable, enforced. Today, there are over 4,000 pairs along the Norwegian coast. Watching one rise from a fjord at sunset, a fish folded against its talons, you are watching a deliberate decision made over 50 years ago to value the bird more than the easy convenience of leaving it alone. It is one of the largest sea eagle populations in the world. Norway did not announce this. There is no monument to the sea eagle. The bird simply came back because the country decided it should. But Norway's first appearance in the global imagination did not come from quiet stewardship. June 8, 793. A small fleet of low, normal ships beaches itself on the eastern coast of England, on the tidal island of Lindisfarne. The ships are about 30 meters long, drawing less than a meter of water, capable of crossing open ocean and then sliding up directly onto a shoreline. The men who get out of them are armed with axes, swords, and round wooden shields. The monastery on the island, founded 150 years earlier by Irish monks, has no defenses. It contains a library of illuminated manuscripts, gold reliquaries, silver chalices, and a community of perhaps 40 monks. The raid lasts a single tide. The monks are killed where they stand or thrown into the sea to drown. The young are bound and taken to the ships. The treasure is loaded. The ships disappear over the northern horizon. We do not know with certainty where they came from.
Most historians now believe
The western coast of what is now Norway. What we know is that the date marks, by general agreement, the beginning of the Viking Age, a period that would last almost 300 years and reshape the entire northern half of Europe. The Norse expanded outward on the strength of one piece of technology, the longship. Plinker-built, oak-hulled, capable of being sailed through ocean swells or rowed up a river. It made the Vikings, briefly, the most mobile people on Earth. They reached Iceland by 870, Greenland by 982, Vinland, the coast of what is now Canada, around the year 1000, almost 500 years before Columbus. And then, gradually, the Viking Age ended. The Norsemen converted to Christianity. They settled. They became kings of new countries, Normandy in France,
the Danelaw in England,
Kievan Rus in the east. The longships were pulled up onto beaches and left to rot. Norway sank back into what it had always been, a hard country on the edge of Europe, mostly poor, mostly forgotten. For the next 800 years, almost no outsider thought about Norway at all. What survives from those middle centuries are the Stave churches. 28 of them remain, scattered through the inland valleys. They are built entirely of wood, vertical staves of pine, blackened by centuries of tar, applied every 20 years to keep the rain out. From a distance, they look like overlapping wooden pagodas, with steep, tiered roofs that climb upward in stages, dragon heads carved into the gable ends. The oldest of them, at Ørnes, above the Lustrafjord, was built around the year 1130.
it is still in use as a church.
Some of the wood you can touch in its walls is 900 years old. Norwegians did not preserve these churches because they were beautiful. They preserved them because they were useful. the same impulse that built them, make something practical, make it well, make it last, would, 800 years later, be the impulse that kept the country from spending its oil money the moment it arrived. On the southwestern coast of Norway, 250 kilometers south of Bergen, sits a small city that until the late 1960s had no particular reason to exist. Stavanger had a sardine cannery and a few thousand residents. The fish stocks were declining. Young people were leaving for Oslo or for America. By 1968, the city's main economic indicator was the falling number of births registered each year. Then, a phone call came in. October 25th, 1969. The drilling rig Ocean Viking is positioned in Block 2/4 of the Norwegian sector of the North Sea, 300 kilometers offshore. Phillips Petroleum, an American company headquartered in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, has spent 2 years and tens of millions of dollars drilling dry hole after dry hole in Norwegian waters. The company's geologists in Oslo have been told to pack up and come home. Management wants to give up, but there is one well left to drill. The rig is on day-rate charter. The money is being spent whether or not the drill bit goes into the ground. So Phillips drills. At a depth of 3,033 meters, 3 kilometers below the seabed, the bit breaks through shale and into a layer of chalk that should not contain anything. The drilling mud comes up dark. The men on the deck pull a core sample. It is saturated with crude oil. The well is plugged for safety. A second well is drilled a kilometer away. On December 23, 1969, 2 days before Christmas, Phillips Petroleum officially informs the Norwegian Ministry of Industry that it has discovered the largest offshore oil field ever found in Western Europe. They name it Ekofisk. The man who takes the phone call, a civil servant named Olav Christiansen, is alone in the office. Most of the ministry has already left for the holiday. What he does not yet know is that the discovery will produce, over the next 50 years, more than 2.5 trillion kroner in wealth. He does not know that the small city of Stavanger will become Norway's oil capital. He does not know that the fields beyond Ekofisk, Statfjord, Troll, Snøhvit, Johan Sverdrup will turn out to be among the richest hydrocarbon basins on the planet. He does not know that what Norway is about to do with this money is not primarily what he or anyone else expects. In June 1972, the Norwegian Parliament unanimously adopts what becomes known as the 10 Oil Commandments. The document is short, barely 2 pages. Its central rule is the one that will define everything that follows. Petroleum revenues belong to the entire Norwegian people. They will be managed in trust for future generations. They will not be allowed to distort the rest of the economy. They will not be spent the moment they arrive. This is not what most oil-rich countries do. Iran, in the same decade, builds palaces and crumbles. Venezuela, with the largest proven oil reserves in the world, will eventually collapse into hyperinflation and mass emigration. Nigeria will see its currency hollowed out and its rural populations abandoned. Iraq will be invaded twice, partly because of the oil. The economic literature has a name for the pattern. It is called the resource curse. Norway will spend the next 50 years quietly proving that the curse can be avoided. But the proof requires a level of national restraint that almost no other country has been willing to attempt. In the highlands of central Norway, 4 hours' drive north of Oslo, there is a national park called Dovrefjell. The name means the Dovre Mountain. The plateau rises above the tree line into a windswept tundra, the southernmost true Arctic landscape in continental Europe. Walking across it, you can encounter, sometimes at a distance of 50 meters, a musk ox. These animals look prehistoric because they are. They survived the last ice age in scattered Arctic populations and were hunted to extinction in mainland Europe centuries ago. By the early 1900s, the only musk oxen left in the world were in northern Canada and Greenland. Norway brought them back. Beginning in the 1930s, animals were captured in eastern Greenland, transported by ship to the Norwegian mainland, and released onto the Dovrefjell Plateau. The herd grew slowly. Today, there are around 300 of them, Europe's only free-roaming population of an animal that until 10,000 years ago ranged across the entire continent. A male muskox can weigh 400 kilograms. He has horns that meet across his forehead in a single armored boss. When threatened, the herd does not run. They form a circle, calves in the center, horns facing outward. They wait. The wolves and bears that used to cull them are long gone. What remains is the pose itself, held against a memory of predators that no longer exist. In the high winter of 1942, in a remote valley in the Telemark region of southern Norway, a small group of Norwegian commandos was preparing for what one of them would later call, in a single sentence, our job. The valley was called Rjukan. The plant was called the Mork. It was, at the time, the only facility in Europe producing heavy water, a substance that, for reasons of nuclear physics, was essential to one path toward an atomic bomb. Nazi Germany had occupied Norway in April 1940 and had taken control of the plant. German production was rising. By early 1942, Nazi nuclear scientists were receiving heavy water shipments from the Mork at a rate the Allies considered alarming. The plant clung to the side of a cliff above a 600-foot ravine. It was guarded by German soldiers. The single suspension bridge that crossed the ravine was mined and floodlit. The German command considered the ravine itself impassable. On the night of February 27, 1943, a team of 9 Norwegian commandos, trained in Britain by the Special Operations Executive, parachuted onto the Hardangervidda mountain plateau weeks earlier, having survived the winter eating reindeer meat, descends into the ravine. They cross a half-frozen river at the bottom. They climb the 500-foot cliff in the dark. They enter the basement of the heavy water plant through a cable duct. They place their charges. They light the fuses. The explosion is muffled by the snow. No shot is fired. No commando is killed. No civilian is harmed. The team escapes on skis across hundreds of kilometers of winter mountains. Some make it to neutral Sweden. Some return to the plateau and resume operations. The leader of the assault team is a 23-year-old named Joachim Ronneberg. The mission is now generally considered the most successful act of sabotage of the entire Second World War. It set back Germany's nuclear program by enough months that, when the war ended, the Reich had not built the bomb. Ronneberg lived to be 99. He died in 2018. In a BBC interview 3 years before his death, he was asked about what he had done at Vemork. He thought for a moment, then he answered, "We just did our job." In a country with a different culture, that sentence would be a kind of false modesty. In Norway, it is the actual cultural product. Runneberg was a national hero. He never lived in a large house, he never gave paid speeches, he never published a memoir. The state funeral he eventually received was, by international standards, restrained. The Vermork plant is now a museum. The cliff he climbed is still there. There is no statue of Joachim Runneberg outside the building. There is instead a small plaque listing the names of the men who took part in the operation. The names are listed in alphabetical order. In 1933, 2,500 kilometers south of Telemark, in the small Danish town of Nykøbing Mors, a Danish-Norwegian author named Axel Sandemos published a novel. The book was called A Fugitive Crosses His Tracks. It was, on its surface, the story of a man fleeing the memory of a murder he had committed. But what made the book famous was not the plot. What made the book famous was a list of 10 rules that Sandemos claimed governed life in his fictional small town of Jante. You are not to think you are anything special. You are not to think you are as good as we are. You are not to think you are smarter than we are. You are not to imagine yourself better than we are.
You are not to think you know more than we do.
You are not to think you are more important than we are. You are not to think you are good at anything. You are not to laugh at us. You are not to think anyone cares about you. You are not to think you can teach us anything. Sandemos did not invent these rules. He grew up in a small town. He was, by his own description, miserable there. The rules, he later said, were already woven into the fabric of Scandinavian community life. He simply wrote them down. What he did not expect was that within a generation, the rules would be claimed by Norway as a kind of national identity, not as a satire, as a self-description. Norwegians began referring to Janteloven, the law of Jante, as if it were a real law that everyone had to follow. In a sense, it is.
There is no statute.
There is no penalty, but a Norwegian who flaunts wealth, brags about achievement, or claims to be exceptional is still met with a particular kind of cool silence that no outsider can quite reproduce. Children are corrected for it. Co-workers are quietly excluded for it. Politicians are punished at the ballot box for it. The country built its tax records on the same instinct. Since 1863, every Norwegian's income and wealth have been published. First, in a printed booklet read aloud in village squares, now on a government website that anyone can search. There is no privacy around money in Norway. There is no privacy because, fundamentally, no one is supposed to have so much that they need to hide it. "800 kilometers north of Oslo, the Lofoten archipelago juts out from the mainland like a row of jagged teeth bitten into the Norwegian Sea. The islands rise straight out of the water, granite and gneiss, 2 billion years old, to peaks that in some cases are still partially capped with snow in midsummer. Below the cliffs, in shallow inlets, are villages of red wooden cabins built on stilts above the high tide line. They are called råbur. Fishermen have been using them for at least 800 years. Lofoten exists for one reason. Every winter, between January and April, an enormous biomass of cod swims south from the Barents Sea to spawn in the relatively warmer waters off the islands. The fish have been doing this for thousands of years. The fishermen of Lofoten have been catching them in roughly the same way for almost as long. The cod is hung on wooden racks to dry in the cold winter wind. 3 months later, it has lost most of its weight, become hard as wood, and is shipped south. This is the same stockfish that built Bergen's wealth in the 14th century. The trade has not stopped. Many of the men who fish these waters today are quite wealthy. Norwegian fishing quotas are valuable. A modern Norwegian fishing boat is a $1 million piece of equipment. The captain of a successful Lofoten cod boat can earn, in a good winter, more than most lawyers in Oslo. Almost none of them act like it. The houses they live in are not noticeably larger than the houses their neighbors live in. They drive ordinary cars. They wear ordinary clothes. They go fishing in the same boats their fathers fished in, with the same nets, in the same waters. Because that is what people in Lofoten do. On the southernmost edge of the Lofoten chain, on a small island called Rust, barely 10 square kilometers of rock and grass, there is a seabird colony, Atlantic puffins. Roughly a quarter of Norway's entire seabird population nests on this single island. In summer, the cliffs are covered with them. They burrow into the soft soil at the cliff tops, lay a single egg, and spend the warm months catching small fish, mainly herring fry, to feed the chick. The colony is shrinking. Over the past 2 decades, the chicks at Rust have begun to starve in their burrows. The herring that used to gather in the waters around Lofoten in vast schools is moving north with the warming sea. The puffins fly out to the old fishing grounds. They find nothing. They return empty-mouthed. The chicks, hatched into a world that no longer feeds them, do not survive. The Norwegian state cannot order the herring to come back. It can only watch the colony shrink, count the chicks each year, and report the numbers. It does. The reports are public. The graph slopes downward. There is no announcement that anyone is being asked to fix. Above the Arctic Circle, in the northernmost third of Norway, the country becomes something different. The trees thin and disappear. The mountains flatten into a broad, wind-swept plateau called Finnmarksvidda. In winter, the sun does not rise for 2 months. In summer, it does not set for 2 months. The temperature in January can drop to -40. This is Sapmi, the homeland of the Sami people, the only indigenous nation officially recognized in the European Union. The Sami have lived here, by the best archaeological evidence, for at least 9,000 years. Their ancestors arrived as the last ice age was ending, following the retreating reindeer herds north. Reindeer herding is still, for some Sami families, the central economy. Around 3,000 Sami in Norway are still actively engaged in it. The animals migrate seasonally, inland in winter, where they can dig through snow to reach lichen, then back to the coast in spring, where the calves are born on green pastures. Some herds still swim across fjords on the migration route. The herders follow on snowmobiles where roads exist, on skis where they do not. Norway's relationship with its first people has not been gentle. From the late 19th century until well after World War II, the Norwegian state pursued a policy known as fornorskingspolitikken, Norwegianization. Sami children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools, where speaking their own language was punished. Sami religious practices were suppressed. Sami land was taken for hydroelectric dams and mines. The official apology came only in 1997, more than 100 years after the policy began. The reconciliation is ongoing. The Sami parliament was established in Karasjok in 1989. Sami languages are now taught in schools. The flag of Sapmi, red, blue, green, and yellow, flies alongside the Norwegian flag at official ceremonies. None of this undoes what was done. It does mean that for the first time in centuries, the Sami logic of restraint, of taking only what is needed, of moving with the seasons rather than against them, is recognized as something the rest of Norway might learn from rather than overwrite. There is a Norwegian word, friluftsliv, that does not translate cleanly into any other language. The literal meaning is free air life. The actual meaning is closer to the conviction that being outside, in weather, is the natural state of a human being, and that being inside is a temporary inconvenience. Norwegians are famously raised on it. Babies are put outside in their prams to sleep, sometimes in temperatures well below freezing, with the understanding that cold air is good for them. School children spend at least one full day a week outdoors, regardless of weather. A national saying, "There is no bad weather, only bad clothing," is not a joke. It is policy. Hardangervidda, in the south-central part of the country, is the largest mountain plateau in northern Europe. 8,000 square kilometers of nothing, no roads, no buildings, no cell coverage, at an average elevation of 1,100 meters. The wind across it can pick up to 80 kilometers an hour without warning. The temperature can drop 30 degrees in an afternoon. On any given summer weekend, several thousand Norwegians are walking across it. The Norwegian Trekking Association maintains a network of over 500 mountain cabins across the country, most of them simple wooden structures with bunks for 15 or 20 hikers. They are unlocked. The system runs on trust. You arrive, you stay the night, you leave the agreed payment in a cash box on the wall. In a country with $2 trillion in savings, the cabins are not built of marble. They are built of wood, painted red, and they have outhouses. This is not because Norway cannot afford better. It is because Norway considers better, in this case, to be worse. In the same mountain country where the cabins stand, there lives a small predator that 20 years ago almost disappeared from Norway entirely. The Arctic fox is built for cold. Its coat is the warmest of any mammal on Earth. In winter, the fur turns pure white and grows on the bottom of the paws, turning the feet into snowshoes. The animal can lower its metabolic rate during the polar night to conserve energy. It hunts lemmings, small Arctic rodents whose populations rise and crash on a 4-year cycle, and follows the lemming numbers up and down. By the early 2000s, fewer than 50 Arctic foxes remained in mainland Norway. A century of fur trapping had reduced them. Climate change had reduced them further. The red fox, larger and more aggressive, had begun moving north into Arctic fox territory and outcompeting them. The Norwegian Environment Agency began a captive breeding program in 2005. Pups were raised in remote enclosures and released into the mountains. Red foxes in the same areas were culled to reduce competition. The work was unglamorous, slow, and largely invisible to the public. Today, there are over 300 Arctic foxes in the Norwegian mountains. Not many, enough. The Arctic fox depends almost entirely on the Norway lemming, a small, reddish-brown rodent the size of a fist, found nowhere else but the Scandinavian fells. In a peak year, there can be hundreds of millions of them. In a crash year, almost none. The entire Arctic food chain, fox, snowy owl, skua, weasel, rises and falls on this single animal. The lemming does not migrate in suicidal mass, plunges into the sea. That is a myth, manufactured for a 1958 Nature documentary in which the production crew herded the animals over a cliff for the camera. What lemmings actually do in peak years is disperse aggressively in search of food, sometimes drowning while attempting to swim across rivers and lakes that look smaller than they are. Norway's wildlife, like Norway's people, is shaped by repetition,
Boom and crash.
migration and return. The fjord that fills and empties with each tide. In a narrow valley in Telemark, the same valley where the Vemork plant once stood, sits the small town of Ryuken. The town is famous for two things. The first is the heavy water sabotage. The second is more recent and more characteristic. Ryuken is built at the bottom of a deep canyon. The mountains around it are so steep and the valley so narrow that for 6 months of the year, from late September to mid-March, the sun does not reach the town center at all. The town sits in shadow. In 2013, Ryuken installed 3 giant mirrors on the mountainside above. Each mirror is 17 square meters. They tilt and rotate by computer to track the sun, reflecting a patch of sunlight down into the town's square.
The patch is about 600 square meters wide.
It moves slowly across the square through the short winter day. The total cost of the project was around 5 million kroner, about $500,000. A wealthy Norwegian municipality could have built almost anything. They built a way to give their citizens a place to stand in the sun on a winter afternoon. Norway's 20th century was not without darkness. In April 1940, German forces invaded the country. The Norwegian king and government escaped to London. The collaborator Vidkun Quisling, whose name has since entered the English language as a noun for traitor, established a Nazi-aligned government in Oslo. The occupation lasted 5 years. During those years, 772 Norwegian Jews were deported to Auschwitz.
Only 34 returned.
The deportations were carried out partly by Norwegian police. The collaboration was less extensive than in some occupied countries. It was not absent. When the war ended, Norway prosecuted Quisling and 24 other collaborators and executed them. The country then settled into a long, sober reconstruction. There were no parades demanding revenge. The reckoning was made in courtrooms. On July 22, 2011, a Norwegian named Anders Behring Breivik detonated a fertilizer bomb outside the Prime Minister's office in Oslo, killing 8 people. He then drove to the small island of Utøya, where the Labour Party youth organization was holding its annual summer camp. He was dressed as a police officer. The teenagers gathered when he called them to him. He shot 69 of them at close range.
Most were under 20.
The country did not break. It also did not forget. The day after the attacks, the Norwegian Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg stood at a memorial in Oslo and said that the answer would be more democracy, more openness, and more humanity. The country built a memorial on the mainland opposite Utøya, a simple, cleared cut in the trees where the names of the dead are inscribed in stainless steel rings rising out of the forest floor. There was no death penalty discussion. There was no expansion of police powers. The trial of Breivik was conducted with extraordinary procedural restraint, in part because the country refused to let him become anything more than a defendant. He was sentenced to 21 years, the maximum under Norwegian law, with the provision that the sentence can be extended indefinitely if he remains a danger. The trees around the Utoya Memorial are growing back slowly. The country has not built a wall around the island. All of which brings us back to the money. In 1990, 18 years after the first oil came on stream from Ekofisk, the Norwegian parliament passed an unusual piece of legislation. The state was about to begin generating every year more income from petroleum than it could responsibly absorb into the domestic economy. Spending it would inflate wages, crush other industries, and leave the country dependent on a finite resource. The Parliament's solution was to put the money somewhere it could not easily be spent. The Government Petroleum Fund, later renamed the Government Pension Fund Global, was established with a single instruction: invest the surplus oil revenues in foreign assets. Manage the fund as if it were a single pool of capital belonging to the entire population, and do not draw it down faster than it can sustainably last. In its first year, the fund received its first deposit, about 2 billion kroner. By 2005, it was worth $150 billion. By 2019, it crossed $1 trillion. By early 2026, it stands at over $2 trillion in total assets, the largest sovereign wealth fund of any kind anywhere on Earth. The fund owns shares in over 7,200 companies across 60 countries. It owns roughly 1.5% of every publicly traded stock on Earth. It is one of the largest single shareholders in Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, JP Morgan, Nestlé. It owns office buildings in Manhattan, residential complexes in Tokyo, renewable energy infrastructure across Germany. Last year alone, the fund earned a profit of $247 billion, more than the total economic output of most small countries. It is administered by an organization called Norges Bank Investment Management, NBIM. The headquarters is in central Oslo. About 650 people work there. The man who runs it is named Nicolai Tangen. When he was appointed in 2020, the country very nearly refused him. Tangen was a Norwegian-born hedge fund manager who had built a successful investment firm in London and become, by Norwegian standards, very wealthy. The Norwegian press treated his appointment as a problem. Politicians questioned whether someone with that much personal money could be trusted to manage public money modestly. The debate went on for months. Tangen's response was to give away most of his personal fortune. He placed the majority of his assets into a charitable foundation. He took a salary of approximately $750,000, a normal to low number for the CEO of a $2 trillion fund anywhere else in the world. He bicycles to work in Oslo. The compromise satisfied just enough Norwegians for the appointment to proceed. The rules he operates under are unique among the world's major investment institutions. The fund is not allowed to invest a single krone inside Norway in order to prevent the wealth from distorting the domestic economy. It is required to track major global stock indexes rather than make speculative bets to keep its strategy transparent and predictable. The Norwegian government is forbidden by parliamentary rule, not by law, but by political conventions so strong it functions as law, from withdrawing more than 3% of the fund's value in any single year. Most years, less is withdrawn. The fiscal rule, established in 2001, explicitly states that the principle must be preserved for future generations. The fund publishes its full holdings on a public website. Anyone can search them. It also maintains an ethical exclusions list, companies the fund refuses to invest in because of their products or conduct. The list currently includes producers of nuclear weapons,
certain tobacco manufacturers,
companies engaged in severe environmental damage, and, as of 2025, several firms judged to be contributing to human rights violations in occupied territories. When the fund excludes a company, it sells its shares first and announces the decision afterwards to avoid moving the market. In 2025, the fund divested its shares in Caterpillar and 5 Israeli banks over their roles in the West Bank. The American government called the decision very troubling. The Norwegian government did not respond beyond restating that the decisions were made by the fund's Ethics Council, not by elected officials. What the structure means in practice is this. A country of 5.5 million people owns a stake in essentially every important business on Earth.
The country is not allowed to spend more than a small
Fraction of that ownership in any given year. The decisions about where to invest are made by people who, by Norwegian law, are removed from political pressure, and the entire system rests on a single national agreement, written into no constitution, enforced by no penalty, that the money belongs to the future, not the present. Most of the people who manage it bicycle to work. If the fund continues to grow at its current pace, by 2050 it will likely exceed $5 trillion. The interest alone will be greater than Norway's annual oil revenues. The country will be, in effect, retired, living on the returns of investments rather than on the extraction of any single resource. By then, the oil will be running out anyway. The transition will be silent.
There will be no announcement.
This is what the title of this documentary refers to: a country with the economic muscle to throw its weight around in any market on Earth. A country that has chosen, deliberately and across generations, to throw its weight around as little as possible. There is a question worth sitting with. The oil that built the fund will eventually end. The North Sea fields are mature now, production peaked in the early 2000s and has been slowly declining ever since. New discoveries are smaller. The country is investing heavily in offshore wind and carbon capture, but those industries will not produce the kind of windfall that hydrocarbons did. There may not be another Ekofisk. Janteloven was easier to maintain when Norway was poor. It was easier still when the wealth was new and felt like luck. What happens to a country's instincts when the wealth is no longer new, when it is simply, for the first time in any country's history, normal? The third generation of Norwegians born after the oil discovery is now in school. They have never known a Norway that was not wealthy. They have grown up surrounded by global media that celebrates exactly the kind of self-promotion their grandparents were taught to avoid. Many of them, particularly in Oslo, have begun to push back against Janteloven openly. Whether the cultural code can survive globalization is a question the country itself does not yet know the answer to. What can be said is this. For a brief period in human history, on the western edge of Europe, a country received an enormous gift and did not lose its mind over it. It built no monuments to itself, it invaded no neighbors. It wrote down rules to protect the future from the present and, against expectation, mostly kept them. Whether anyone learns from this, whether the example travels, is another question entirely. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey.